is my aunt, I feel, was the first person who made me excited about horror movies. She explained the plot of Psycho to me in a way that made it seem like exciting and not so scary. That was a pretty big scaredy cat when I was younger. I was very easily, even movies that weren't horror movies were scary to me. I thought the Titanic, like the very beginning of the Titanic, was like the scariest thing I had ever seen for the long time, when they're just like underwater, like going through the ship. Like things like that were very, very frightening to me. But she explained it in a way where I started to appreciate the storytelling, I think, more than the being scared of it. So I would say probably A Nightmare on Elm Street was one of those ones that slowly got me into it. And then also I would just watch whatever my sister rented from Blockbuster. So like The Ring, The Grudge, those like early 2000s horror movies. That's how I slowly kind of tiptoed my way in. And then eventually I was just full blown in like anything I could catch on TV. I would watch it. I would rent it as much as I could. And I feel like at some point it just became more fun and like more of a comfort thing than something to be fearful of.
Similarly, I also had a family member, my sister, who was very adamant about letting me see whatever I wanted. As growing up, I wasn't really given limitations towards what I could watch. I was left to my own devices. The original Nightmare on Elm Street, Pennywise and It, the OG It, those movies terrified me, absolutely terrified me growing up. As I got older, I started to appreciate the feeling of watching scary movies a bit more. It was kind of like a place for this scaredy cat to be brave. Oh, what can I handle? What can I handle? What's my limitations and whatnot? Mid-early 2000s, that period of time, I'd say, is when I really got into the genre, because I feel like we were just dishing out horror movies like Halloween candy. Like, it was just everywhere.
How did you two come to meet each other? And then when did the idea for the podcast come about?
Oh, so we met in college. We went to a performing arts school and we were in the same group, which meant that we were in all of the same classes. So we just saw each other. Somewhere along the way, we both discovered that we liked horror and we started playing horror video games and like watching movies together. But the podcast, that was obviously 10 years ago ish. But the podcast came about actually at the beginning of the pandemic, because that's when I first started listening to podcasts, and it just sounded so fun. I just remember thinking like, I could do this. I wanted a hobby. I needed something to do. I wasn't feeling very creatively stimulated at the time.
I mean, yeah, like at the time everything was closed down. Like there was nothing really to do creatively. And so it was one of those things that like Erica just had really great timing with the phone call. But talking about movies is something that we've done for a long time, just throughout our friendship. So the podcast itself was just really putting it in a form that more people can listen to instead of just the two of us.
So then once the podcast gets started, you're covering sort of a mix of modern films and then obviously some more classic horror films. And you've mentioned some subgenres that you're really a fan of. Obviously, Roshane, you mentioned zombie films. But when it comes to films you cover on the podcast, what are kind of your favorite type of horror films to talk about?
So I think one of the big things with us, at least at the start, between Erica and Erica's more of like the old school buff. Like she's seen a lot of like the oldies from like 70s, 80s, 90s, what have you. 2000s beyond, I've seen like a majority of those. So between the two of us, we had a nice mixture of like, all right, Erica would be looking at the oldies, trying to find some classics for us to cover. I'd be like looking through like, all right, what just got released last week that everybody's talking about? And I think that has been fun because it's opened up a bit of variety for us, where it's like we have different tastes. But one of my favorite feelings is when we cover perhaps like indie horror movies or movies that people have possibly seen but no one else is talking about, and just getting those reactions of like, oh my god, somebody's finally talking about this movie.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I like talking about body horror movies or slasher movies just because they're my favorite like subgenre, and I love making Roshane watch body horror movies because he normally doesn't, and I like making him watch them. So I enjoy those and just hearing his thoughts.
On top of doing the show with just you two, you've also had the chance to work with a couple other different podcasts, a couple other horror podcasts. And kind of what's that like, getting to work with, people who both love the genre as well as love doing a podcast and talking about them?
Yeah, I think, we love doing collabs. We've been trying to get better at it. And having people on our show and going on other people's shows. I think, honestly, one of the hard things about it is not having the episode be like 5 hours long, because it's so easy to just talk and get excited and everybody wants to say their piece. And those episodes can become like, we have to edit those more than any other episodes we have.
The other addition I want to throw on there too is just like working in the field of this specific genre and podcasting. It also allowed us to get to know a lot more of the horror community in general. And that's something that I honestly, even though I love scary movies, I wasn't like too involved in the community as much until we started this. And it has been one of the most welcoming, awesome groups of people that I've ever met. And like continually, the more people we meet, the more people we collaborate with and work with, that idea just gets solidified more and more, because everyone is so sweet. Everyone's so supportive. And it's like, yeah, we like seeing people get mangled up on screen, but like in person, everyone's very nice, everyone's very thoughtful. And like our show is very conversational, and it's very fun to just, again, like Erica said, get to sit down with these people who love scary stuff, who love movies, and then just talk about the things that we like.
There are some things I think that just subconsciously we feel very similar about. So it's also, I think, really nice to bring in a new person who potentially disagrees with us, because I always think those lead to fun conversations, because there are just certain things that we, especially in horror, like we both lean towards in the same direction. So it's always fun to get someone who leans in the other direction. So because I don't know, I just enjoy those conversations and seeing like other people's point of views.
When it comes to recommending horror films, recommending them to fans, recommending them to friends, what is kind of your go-to horror film that you will always recommend to people?
Straight off the
straight off the dome.
Straight off the top.
I would say for like your everyday average, just like I like movies, maybe not just a huge horror fan. I feel like the original Scream is just a great one to like cover everything. I feel like for people who aren't too familiar with scary stuff, Scream is a great starting point. And then from there, Hereditary, any of the Ari Aster stuff definitely jumps in extremity when it comes to the content of it. However, like if people are trying to see a different side of the genre, I'll recommend something like that. And then as far as like stuff that I like, Dawn of the Dead, Night of the Living Dead, 28 Days Later, any zombie film, I'd be like, look, I got you. You want to see zombies eating people? I got a whole list for you. Don't worry.
I guess Scream is a really good one, actually. I tend to recommend kind of more of like the classics. If someone's just like, I've never really watched a horror movie, I normally start with kind of like the big ones, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween. Just because I feel like that's just such a nice place to start. Plus, they're not too scary. I think that's the issue I have with recommending things for people, is what I find scary is so different than what maybe a more casual fan finds scary. And I tend to recommend things that I think aren't scary to me, and they'll come back and say, why did you tell me to watch this? That was too much. I that's the issue that I have. So I always feel like those are safe picks for me, because I do think that there's an element to those films that, although it's so inherent, like there are things that are in them that are so specific to the horror genre and that have made such a big kind of like influence on the genre. I think enough time has passed that they're not too scary. And so I just always feel like those are safe bets for people who are more casual or maybe just haven't ever seen those more classic horror films. I feel like those are good ones to start with.